name is Elizabeth Kneebone. I'm the research director at the Turner Center for Housing Innovation at UC Berkeley. And I'm going to be talking today about some work we've been doing at the center to better understand where lower income and lower resource households can afford to live across the country compared to where jobs tend to locate. And in this work, we focus particularly on high poverty neighborhoods, both to understand what the current employment and commute patterns look like for residents of those neighborhoods, but also to understand the implications of those patterns on longer term strategies to increase access to economic opportunity and upward mobility for those residents. In doing this work, we're using the American Community Survey data at the census tract level as our proxy for neighborhoods. We also draw on the longitudinal employer household dynamics data on origins and destinations of commutes. The decision to focus, especially on high poverty neighborhoods, really comes in large part because of the extensive and growing literature on the negative consequences that can come from living in an area of concentrated poverty. Just living in a high poverty neighborhood in and of itself can create barriers and obstacles to accessing economic opportunity and mobility. And those negative consequences of concentrated poverty really begin to emerge when poverty rates reach 20% or beyond. And so that's the threshold that we use throughout this work to identify areas of high poverty across the country. And with that measure, we find that nearly 30% of the nation's neighborhoods are high poverty. Those neighborhoods contain a disproportionate share of the nation's rental stock. And particularly as we look at rental options that would be affordable to a family living below the poverty line or a household with a federal rental subsidy, the housing options for those households, the majority are located in high poverty areas. But we see a very different picture when we look at what the employment landscape looks like. Most jobs are located outside of these neighborhoods. They skew much more heavily to low poverty communities with single digit poverty rates and moderate poverty neighborhoods with poverty rates between 10 and 20%. And when we disaggregate that overall distribution to look at particular industries and sectors, some skew even more heavily to low poverty communities. And in particular, a number of service sector jobs are more likely to be found in low poverty communities like retail, food service and accommodation, arts and entertainment, administrative support. So when you see this employment landscape and overlay it with where we know housing and particularly affordable rental housing tends to cluster, it's perhaps not surprising that of the more than 31 million commutes that begin in high poverty neighborhoods, most end in a community with lower poverty. And nearly a third end in a neighborhood with single digit poverty rates. Now, the lower the poverty of the destination, the longer a worker typically has to travel to get there. For a worker living in a high poverty neighborhood and going to a low poverty work destination, that typical commute of 12.5 miles one way as the crow flies is more than twice that of a worker who both lives and works in a high poverty neighborhood. And these national statistics really obscure a great amount of variation that can be found across different types of communities and parts of the country, where we see distances stretching much further than the national median. Looking at this at the metropolitan scale, it's clear that for several regions across the country, for residents in high poverty neighborhoods, the typical commute distance to get to a low poverty work destination stretches 20, 30, even 50 miles or more one way as the crow flies. And for residents in rural communities, those distances can stretch even further. Now, one common theme that has emerged, whether you're looking at a high poverty neighborhood in a big city, in suburban areas, in rural communities, a common trend that emerges is when workers are commuting to a low poverty destination, those low poverty neighborhoods, while they may be rich with job opportunities or employment, they tend to have far fewer rental options than the high poverty neighborhoods these workers are starting from. Not only do they have far fewer rental options in these low poverty destinations, the ones that are there tend to be much more expensive than the typical monthly rents in the high poverty origins these workers are starting from. It really underscores that while communities across the country want to compete for jobs, really want to build their economic base, far fewer are doing what is really required to make sure there's enough housing to accommodate the workers who are going to fill those jobs, particularly at lower ends of the earnings distribution. And this is something that plays out, again, across every state and all different types of communities across the country. But if we're looking at a case study or a place to dig deeper about how this actually plays out within a given community, the state of California is really at the forefront of these dynamics. It's really emblematic of the affordability challenges and the disconnects that can create these lengthy commutes for residents of high poverty neighborhoods. We could choose many different regions to dig deeper within California on these patterns, but let's take Stockton as an example. It's just to the south of the state's capital region. It's to the east of the San Francisco Bay Area and Silicon Valley. And the Stockton metro area, more than 40% of its neighborhoods are high poverty. They're speckled throughout the city and the surrounding suburbs. Nearly a third of the region's commutes start in these high poverty neighborhoods, and most of them end in a place with lower poverty. In fact, 30,000 of these commutes end in neighborhoods with single-digit poverty rates. For those commuters, most of them are leaving the region altogether. So about just over a third of the commutes that originate in Stockton's high poverty neighborhoods and end in the low poverty area, those neighborhoods are actually located within the Stockton metro area. The rest are going beyond the metropolitan boundaries to find work. See, some are traveling to the north, to the Sacramento region, but the real magnet is to the west in the San Francisco Bay Area and in Silicon Valley. Together, those counties account for nearly 40% of the commute destinations that are originating in Stockton's high poverty neighborhoods. And when we dig into the housing affordability patterns in the origins and destinations of these commutes, it really lays bare and pulls into sharp focus the differences that exist in what's available and affordable to families across and households across these regions. So take, for instance, what the typical rent is in the high poverty origins of the Stockton metro area, and when workers are finding work in lower poverty communities within the Stockton metro area, that's San Joaquin County. The difference between typical monthly rents in those origins and destinations is $600 a month. So it's more affordable by $600 a month in the high poverty origins that these workers are living in. If you move to the west to look to the San Francisco Bay Area and Silicon Valley, that differential grows to $1,000 or more a month. So clearly there are potential cost savings to be had given what the lower rents that the residents of these high poverty neighborhoods are likely paying in Stockton versus what they would be able to find in their low poverty destinations. Once you start to account for the cost of the commute to get to those destinations, it very quickly erodes what these potential savings could look like. So even for those workers who are commuting within the Stockton metro area, the cost of a commute both ways, given the typical distances they're traveling, quickly eats up about half of what could be the cost savings between the median rents in their origin versus destinations. When you move again west towards the San Francisco Bay Area and Silicon Valley, the commute costs quickly catch up to and in many cases eclipse what those potential housing cost savings could be. And I should point out that these estimated commute costs are in a lot of ways conservative because they don't include things like whether or not people are paying tolls, whether or not they have to pay for parking at their destination, whether or not they have to pay for additional childcare to cover the longer hours associated with those commutes, or other personal trade-offs they might be making to make these lengthy commutes. It also doesn't reflect the impact of these trips on the infrastructure and the costs of the infrastructure, nor does it reflect the cost in terms of environmental impacts and implications for climate resiliency and sustainability in the long run. Again, this example that we're looking at is within the California context, which we know has really stark affordability challenges. Yet these same dynamics play out across all different kinds of communities across the United States, urban, suburban, and rural. And it really underscores that if we are to truly build a more equitable future as a country moving forward, we have to come to terms with these spatial inequities that are baked into our employment and housing landscape. These disconnects are creating costs in a lot of ways, both on individual households and workers, and more generally, as we think again about climate and foregone productivity, other implications of having to create these long and conduct these long commutes. What this really calls for is a sort of two-pronged approach that addresses the impacts of these spatial inequities. One, really investing in these high poverty communities to ensure that there are more opportunities within these neighborhoods for people to take advantage of where they live. It also calls for making sure that we're aligning our housing, land use, and economic development policies in ways that ensure that more workers across the income distribution can live closer to where they work and access these areas that are rich in both employment and other types of opportunities, especially making sure that that's possible without having to have them commute such great distances to get there. Thank you. I appreciate you tuning in. Thanks for listening.